Now I know that you're hot and that I stand between you and dinner and a refreshing drink. So the good news is that it's now story time before bed, before the end of the day. And what I'm going to do is take us back to the themes of democracy and peace and cultural diplomacy as the overarching theme, as a way of trying to round up what, from what I've seen from half a day, must have been a quite extraordinary few days here, of so many different perspectives and ideas brought together. So thank you for the invitation to be here, and I'm really sorry I've missed quite a lot of it by not being able to get here before today. But let's start, if you like, from what is very clear to me is that more than ever, we now need to find ways to expand and use better the diplomatic toolkit that we have available to us. Look at war in Europe, look at the challenges of China, and sometimes the drumbeat of potential war that you hear, especially across the Atlantic. The rise of populism, however you choose to define it, the uncertainty that people feel about the transatlantic relationship with the United States, all of these things tell me that we need to not only prepare, as some of our speakers have said, for what may be the need to use our hard power and to be ready in terms of defence and security, but also to think similarly, to think in the same way about building our diplomatic capabilities. Diplomacy is not just about sending an ambassador to sit somewhere nice and have a good time, or even somewhere difficult and have a difficult time. It's about a whole set of things that countries and organizations, groupings of nations and continents do that make a difference to our capacity to resolve problems, sort out crises, and see trouble ahead long before it turns into something that is very difficult to manage. And the way you need to think about it is very simply this: there is no issue that any country in the world is facing that they can solve alone. You can't build your economy without good trade deals. You can't deal with serious and organised crime unless you collaborate with other people in other countries. You can't tackle cyber security questions. You certainly can't deal with pandemics. You can't begin to sort out the biggest issue we face of all, which is, of course, the climate. And you can't deal with regional conflicts or local problems unless you are collaborating, working with somebody else. There isn't an issue. You can't even help your people, if you're a government, to have education abroad or to travel safely unless you've got consular and diplomatic services operating in other countries. There is no issue that any government is facing that can be resolved on its own. So that means you need diplomatic action everywhere. And at the heart of diplomacy and the way we do diplomacy is cultural diplomacy. And I'm going to describe that in 4 different little stories, the way that I see in my lifetime and in my experience cultural diplomacy works. And I had to think really hard when I got invited, and I've confessed this to Mark already, about what it was, because you can think of it in very rigid terms, things from a British perspective like the British Council, or you can think in a more fluid way that it's about all sorts of relationships. And it's all of that, but it's actually really the binding elements of what diplomacy really is. So let me take you to the beginning of the Arab Spring. Those of you who come from nations in North Africa will know we should never have called it spring, because spring in Egypt, especially with the Sirocco winds that burn across. It's a bit like here, the heat. It's dusty, it's difficult. It's a classic European response. By not even understanding the climate of the countries that we're dealing with, we think of it in our own terms, as was pointed out to me many times. But you remember that it all started really from a young man called Mohamed Bouazizi in a small town in Tunisia who couldn't get a permit to sell his fruit and vegetables, which was the only way he had of supporting his family. He didn't have enough money to bribe the police. He couldn't sell his goods. So in desperation, at the end of everything, he set fire to himself. And he died 2 weeks later from the terrible burns that were inflicted. And something happened. Something built around social media, around young people. It established in people's minds, especially young people, the lack of opportunity and possibilities that came from his experience was reflected across the whole region. It went like a tsunami. We couldn't see where it would begin or end for each country. But what was mostly said to me in countries like Tunisia, like in Egypt and in Libya, was put best by a young man, another Mohammed, who in Benghazi, where I went after the bombing had stopped to try and stop Gaddafi's troops from taking Benghazi and destroying the National Transitional Council, the people we hoped who would run Libya, at least in the interim. And this young man who'd been in prison for 7 years, but was still 28, 29, and he was standing outside the room that I was going to go into to talk to a whole range of people from civil society, and he said, "Kathy, it's really easy. We want what you've got. You've got democracy as a way of life. You don't even think about it. It just is." And as those countries moved to do the thing that countries do when they want to symbolize change, they call an election. I know what we'll do, we'll call an election. And elections are really, really important, of course, in democracies. They let you throw governments out, bring governments in, change presidents, elect a new one, whatever. But they are the cherry on the icing on the cake of what I call deep democracy. And deep democracy is where cultural diplomacy meets the dramatic changes of the Arab Spring or the changes anywhere in the world. Because what I describe as deep democracy is that interwoven set of things: trade unions, civil society, NGOs, people who are campaigning, political parties, judges who are independent, police who work for you and don't arrest you, knowing that your vote, when it is counted, will be counted, knowing that you are safe when you go into a polling station, being able to see a free media that can tell you what your government is doing right or wrong. All of these things weave together over time to create deep democracy. And what that means is that even though democracy is never a straight line, it wibbles about like that. Even when you think you've got a wonderful democracy, the wrong people get elected, in your view, or people try and play around with it to stop it working as effectively as it might. Whatever. The point about it being deep is it carries on. And it's deep because it's about the culture that you have created within the society. And the people in Libya or in Egypt or in Tunisia that I spoke to understood that it was more than an election. But that's what we tend to head towards, instead of thinking, what are the other things we must build as well? And so cultural diplomacy for me, of those of us living in a democratic society and knowing that if you want to provide for people the best that you possibly can, to give people what everybody in the world wants, which is to be safe and secure, to have a job, to have your kids in school, to have a home to live in, to have friends, to be able to live a life that you would all recognise, which is what I've heard everywhere in the world. To do that, you need democracy. But democracy is about all of this interwoven depth. And that's what you need cultural diplomacy for, because over days, weeks, months, and decades, countries who are democratic can work people to people, civil society to civil society, trade union to trade union, journalist to journalist, to help build and support the development of that. So number one for me, cultural diplomacy is critical for anyone who is trying to help build and support democracy, even in countries where we believe, or they believe, it has been established for a very, very long time. Because democracy is slow, and it moves around, and it wibbles about. And as I always say of my own country, Magna Carta in 1215 was the time and the moment when people felt the beginnings of a very, very early democracy. But it took 800 years from then before people who looked like me were allowed to vote. The second little story I want to tell you is cultural diplomacy in the context of negotiations. And some of you know that I led the Iran negotiations for 4.5 years. My job, designated by the UN, was to chair and manage the negotiations. And negotiating with 6 countries on your side who are very different: China, Russia, United States, France, Germany, Britain, and of course with the Iranians. Everything has to work in every language. Everything has to be understood and defined in ways that can be managed. And we met regularly for years in order to achieve that. But when I begin to talk to students about how you do negotiations, my first question is always, who are you looking at? Who is opposite the table? Who are they? What do you know about them? What are the things about them that you need to understand? So in your first meeting with them, you have taken the time and trouble to have established as much as you possibly can about their culture, their history, their knowledge, their position in the world, and as importantly, how they look at you. When they look at you, what do they see? Because it's not what you think you are, it's what they think you are. And unless you understand all of those different things, you will never be able to negotiate, certainly internationally, or I would argue anywhere. And it plays into how you begin to think about developing relations, not just in the moment of a major negotiation, because this was the most important negotiation in the world at that time. We had 1,000 journalists camped outside of the hotel for weeks. It was a negotiation that required us to find a solution that they could live with and we could live with. Because the best and most successful negotiated agreements are when people are able to go home and sell it and live with it and support it. And these things again come back to how much time and effort and the drip, 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 drip of diplomacy that translates into cultural diplomacy, which is, who are these people? What do we know? How do they operate? How do you begin to have the conversation that enables you to be able to resolve the issues? And it's in the detail. So many of you will know, of course, being Shia Muslim, the Iranians do not touch me, I'm a woman. Knowing that matters because I'm a hugger. And there were many occasions when my chief of staff had to say, don't touch, as I walked towards them, because I'd be going, oh, otherwise. But they would also show me how to position myself in photographs. So they would say, sit in a particular way to show that you are in charge, to show that you have power, to show that you show respect. All of these things, and you do it every day in your life with lots of people that you work with, all of these things are part of the toolkit that is about cultural diplomacy. It's about recognition and respect for whoever it is you're dealing with at any given moment. And all I would say to you is, do not underestimate it as a vital part of what you have in that toolkit. that helps you get into that first conversation, or even beyond that first conversation with the people that you are dealing with. So think about democracy deep, think about the things you have to do, and think about in any situation, particularly one in conflict, one of the things you have to do is go find out who it is you're dealing with. My personal way of doing it is what I call the warm-up. So whenever I met the Iranians, which over 4.5 years was roughly once a month, we always had dinner the night before the negotiations. I love Iranian food. This was not a hardship. But the most important thing about it was to find out what was going on, what mood everyone was in, how were we going to be the next day when we sat opposite each other in a negotiation. And one thing I learned that, again, I always tell people when I'm talking about negotiation is the great thing about doing that is the next morning when you're into the really difficult stuff and you sit opposite as not friends, as not enemies, but certainly as people trying to find an agreement, but with a lot to say, the first thing you can say is, thank you for dinner. And it's really difficult to yell at somebody who's just thanked you for dinner. So remember that. My third example I want to talk to you about is something that actually we've talked about a bit already in the course of the conversations we've had, which is about the amount of time and energy we put into old friendships and old relationships in order to make sure that they are renewed. When the Ukraine war began, I got a message from someone I know well, an African leader, and he said effectively, there you go again, Europe. You'll be wanting us to join in with whatever it is you decide to do. Before I even think about it, he said, you tell me how many coups there have been on the African continent and how many countries have had armed conflicts in any year or group of years that you choose to pick on in the last decade. And of course, I completely failed. Just for information, the ones I've eventually found, there have been 17 coups in sub-Saharan Africa in the last 6 years and 18 armed conflicts in 2021 alone. Some of you may have lived through those. The point being that there is an assumption that we tend to make in a European and a Western perspective that somehow our issues others will join into because they're really important and you love us and want to support us. And you kind of feel, fine, but when does it come the other way? There are 40 countries that have not joined in to the UN resolutions on Russia and Ukraine, who have not supported Ukraine in being invaded as a sovereign nation. Most of them are not doing it because they disagree with the principles. It's not because they disagree with the fundamentals at all. It's because these old relationships have not translated, and these countries rightly and understandably say, thank you very much, but we will decide for ourselves how we conduct our relationships in the future. We want relations with more countries. We don't want necessarily our economies to take a hit because you say so, because you're not going to pay us for what we've lost. And anyway, when did we last see you? So when it comes to thinking about what we loosely call the global south, but which I would argue is about countries with old relations, there is a huge amount to be done to actually show them the respect, not just of the moment, but of the, back to my drip, drip of decades of being prepared to spend the time and the energy in being prepared to sit down, and this is something Mark and I talked about, and not just talk to them, but listen, to understand what nations are going through. If you think simply about climate change and small island states and the desperation that many of them have felt as they literally see the water come up the beach and come closer and closer. When you talk to countries that have had tremendous challenges of flood or famine or internal conflicts or regional conflicts. These are nations that demand and deserve the amount of energy and effort that we should put into them, and in a sense, much, much more than the energy and effort we keep asking them to put into us. And so, back to cultural diplomacy, one of the things that's really important for the longer term is making sure that we have developed these relationships and translated old relationships, which were often born of things that were negative, into positive relationships for the future that enable us to be able to have the dialogue. It doesn't mean they will always do what we think. It does mean that we'll be having the dialogue rather than simply the expectation. And we shouldn't underestimate the shock that there was when we realized that countries were not simply going to follow us on this, especially, as I've said, because it wasn't about disagreeing with the fact that there was a problem. It was disagreeing with us about what they should be expected to do. And in some cases, actually saying, we think there are better ways. We think we can help solve these issues better than you can. Why do you assume that somehow you can do it? My last example is, of course, the European Union. Because if you want to see cultural diplomacy in action on a good day, it's got to be the EU. And I say this with enormous regret that my country is no longer in the European Union, and happiness that somehow we're still European, even if that doesn't quite give us what we wanted, as I watched my passport being stamped today as I arrived in Berlin. But, you know, there is something about bringing 27 countries with others from the Western Balkans, Ukraine, from Moldova, to come into the family. There's something very special about being able to take all of these diverse nations, 23 languages of the EU, the way that they are able to collaborate, often very noisily. People always say to me, oh, they'll never agree, listen to them. Somebody's screaming about this, Hungary yelling about that, Germany's not happy about this. But the great thing about Brussels, and this is something that is deeply rooted in the culture of the creation of the European Union, Brussels is the only place, excuse me, the only place on earth where diplomats fail if they stick to their national position. Everywhere that a diplomat is sent in the world except Brussels, your job is to represent your country, to stick to your position, to be prepared to defend it forever, and never ever to give in to whoever they are over there. Well, in Brussels, if you do that, you've failed. That's the end of your diplomatic career. And it's the only place where that is true. Because the purpose of Brussels is to find solutions, compromise, ways forward. They're never brilliant in many people's eyes. They're sometimes extraordinary, but they always find them. I chaired 50 formal meetings of the Foreign Affairs Council and endless defence and other councils. 50 meetings. We never voted. We never failed to reach agreement. And in the room, on any subject I could think of, there would be somebody, a nation, a foreign minister, a diplomat, who had a knowledge and an expertise that people could get behind and understand. And that really, really matters. So this building of coalitions, the building of groups to come together, which is about living and working and studying and traveling and building a new culture that is called European, that still has everything about you as an individual nation, is quite the most extraordinary project the world has ever seen. And a fundamental and deep part of that is it's based on cultural diplomacy that comes together. Because Finland is here, I also have to tell a tiny story, which is that when I first chaired the Foreign Affairs Council meeting of 27 countries before Croatia joined, Alex Stubb, your president now, leaned across the room, I was terrified, and said, Kathy, what's it like to be the only woman in the room? And I was the only woman in the room. 27 foreign ministers were all men. My answer, you'll be pleased to hear, was, doesn't matter, Alex, I'm in charge. So, but my very final point to you is that the great thing about developing a real understanding and structure and way forward on what we call cultural diplomacy is that it addresses the one thing that has driven me craziest about all of the crises that lie unresolved, all of the issues that I see bubbling up, which is that we never, ever think long-term enough. I don't understand why we think that you can spend 6 months trying to solve something that took decades to bubble up and erupt, and then we can move on to the next problem and not expect it to erupt again. When I brought the two prime ministers of Serbia and Kosovo together for the first time, two men, same age, living very close to each other, a few kilometers away, who had never met, they were sweating, they were terrified of what their people would say, but they managed to make it into my office. And within a few moments, it became very clear to me that we were going to be able to find some level of agreement, which we did. Took an awful lot of work, a lot of screaming, especially by me, a lot of shouting, especially by me, a lot of making them do things, especially by me. But in the end, we did it. But in the course of it, they would talk to me with great passion about the Battle of Kosovo and how significant and important that was to everything we were discussing. And for those of you who don't know, the Battle of Kosovo was in 1389. So if you think about how long conflicts and problems and issues can be in societies, can be under the surface, can be waiting to bubble up, can be waiting to erupt, and how little time we put into saying we can resolve this. We need to think years, sometimes decades, to get to ultimate solutions that will bring peace and prosperity. And in all of that, it is cultural diplomacy that's really at the heart of it. So as the clouds gather, literally, but as they gather around us and as we see more problems coming forward, my plea is for more of what we do, not less, and for more institute work like this one and conferences like this. Thank you for listening. You've been really kind.
Thank you very much, Baroness Ashton. So I believe we have several questions. We have one here, another one in the back.
Hi, thank you so much for the great speech. You talked about problems erupting and conflicts that they build up over time. I'm from Estonia. I was born in free Estonia in 1999, but Estonians have been living under and through the Russian repressions and occupation. You said that if you want to negotiate, you must have respect for the other party. As an Estonian, I wouldn't say I have a lot of respect for aggressors such as Russia. So if it was up to you today to start the negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, what would you do?
I think, and I'm sure you would too, you always have to differentiate between the leadership of a country and a country. There are millions and millions and millions of Russians who probably really disagree. There are many millions of Russians who've got very little idea of what's really going on because of the propaganda and the control of the media. So we can't, and I know you wouldn't, we can't put them all in a box marked this, because at some point we have to deal with the fact that as Europeans especially, we need a relationship with Russia that may be 50 years away, but we're going to need one. So it's about differentiating that. That's the first thing. And again, we're back to cultural diplomacy, because that's about people to people. It's about opportunities which may be few and far between, but do exist, to talk to Russians about issues beyond. Remember, when the Ukrainian crisis first began, we still carried on with the Iran talks. So I would fly from Vienna, where I was working with the Russians, with Sergei Ryabkov, the deputy foreign minister, to Kyiv, where I was attacking the Russians. They would fly back to Moscow and attack me, and then we'd fly back to Vienna and carry on. So on climate change with China, on all sorts of issues, you are always trying, in my view, to find ways to not be dealing with those particular leaders, but to find ways to carry on the conversation. We have to make sure, to answer your question specifically, in order for Ukraine to make the decision that only Ukraine can make about whether to carry on, stop, when and how it wants to move forward, we have to make it as strong as possible. It must be able to be strong enough to deal with whatever comes next. So support for Ukraine is absolutely crucial. And we also have to help them, because wars never end with straight lines. They end in a mess. They end with people feeling that they've not got what they wanted. They end with sorrow and tragedy and horror as a backdrop to anything that comes afterwards. And we have to be prepared to help make sure that as far as we possibly can, there's not only a short-term solution, but a long-term one. And in that long-term one, especially for countries like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, there has to be, what does this mean for one day what the relationship with Russia will be? And where I would start is, what will have happened to make sure that this cannot happen again? What will we have achieved and done to make sure that Russia does not come back in 5 years or 10 years when it's regrouped and becomes stronger? And those will be the questions to answer.
Thank you very much. And we have one more question in the back.
Thank you very much. Clearly, we are in a time when there is a new global order emerging, which means a change in how decision-making is done globally. And we talk sort of, if I put my development economist hat on, then we talk about sort of double standards and what can we do to make the voice of developing countries, or the South, the global South, as we call it, so better heard. But at the same time, how do we do that without succumbing to cultural relativism and without undermining some of the values that actually many people in the global South aspire to, and values that would actually make their lives much better? So how do we find this balance between sort of giving more voice to those who need to have more voice? And this is speaking to also the point that you made, separate the country from the leaders, but at the same time, without being apologetic for our values and sort of remaining a beacon of hope, maybe for people all over the world that want a fairer system.
It's a really good question, and I always start from the very basic principle that we are our values or we are nothing. So I will say to anyone I meet, human rights matter, and the only criteria for them to apply to you is to be human. There is no other criteria. It doesn't matter who you are, what you are, how you define yourself. Human rights apply to you if you fit into the category called human. And I've said that to leaders in extraordinary places who've disagreed with me, shall we say. It's really important that those who are part of, especially Europe, absolutely 100% understand that you have signed up to and you are judged by the values and ideals that you hold, because we're nothing without it. When you deal with other leaders and countries, they will not hold those views at all. They barely believe in anything except their own ability to take as much money out of their own country as they possibly can. Or they believe in creating a system where they've established a dynasty for themselves. I mean, we've all met them. I've met quite a lot of leaders I'd probably rather have seen in jail than having a cup of tea with, but you have the cup of tea. But you're also right that you're not really talking to them, you're talking to the people. So you have to make judgments, and it's a judgment about, do we support this country in helping them to develop education and helping them to develop their society, their economy, recognizing that their leaders are not doing this because they believe in the same values we do. And the trick is to make sure that you control the money so they don't, and to make sure that it's understood who you are, because that's part of the way that you get across to people that there's a better life and there's a better possibility. And the best way, in my whole experience of helping people, is to give them an education. If you educate boys, and especially now girls, who are more and more under threat and attack, give them an education, make them be the best doctors, astronauts, painters, dancers, teachers they can possibly be, and they will get to the conclusions about the kind of life and society they want even faster than you could imagine.
I believe we have time for one more.
Thank you so much for your good expressions and also for the presentations. I'm Nurbash from Afghanistan. You are involved of 2009 until 2014 for the policy of the European for the Afghanistan situation. In 20 years also connected your idea in European countries for Afghanistan. Now you know the 21 of August 2001 is collapse of the Afghanistan government. My question is that 3 times in Doha conferences about the Afghanistan situation, nothing, just talking, nothing for the hope of for the people of Afghanistan. Now the woman is not going to the school, university, and the children's. What do you think? Because now it's 3 years left, 3 years. The regime of Taliban is now in Kabul. The new what's your advice? What is your saying for the people of Afghanistan for the situations in Afghanistan? Thank you.
Nothing has happened because nobody knows what to do, in a way. I mean, there are bits of the equation, but nobody's put it together yet in a way that would make a real significant difference for the people of Afghanistan. Personally, I don't know what it was that made us think that one generation of girls going to school was going to make the difference. You know, these are long-term projects. This is 5 generations of girls going to school before it becomes embedded in a community, in a society, such that it's very difficult to rip it up, such that people will not go along with it, such that you can make change, such that a society is willing to stick with a better way of doing something. And this is back to my point about long term, that the challenges when we engage in trying to solve one problem are that we have to understand the responsibility that lies with us for solving or engaging with the rest. And you can see that across the world. It's my whole sort of issue about we tend to try and solve the immediate, and then we end up with a longer term set of issues that will come back again and become immediate. Think about Haiti, a place I went to in 2010 when the big earthquake happened. It had been receiving aid from the UN since 1955. I couldn't see where the aid had gone, not because people had taken it, but because the country had never resolved some of the really difficult underlying questions that could have built the economy. And without building the economy, it couldn't do anything about all of the issues of poverty, all of the questions about why they didn't build for another earthquake when it was obvious they were going to have one. And look at it now. 80% of Haiti is run by gangs. The government's collapsed. It's a nightmare. and you've got troops going in to try and help from Kenya, but there's a limit to what they'll be able to do on their own. That, if ever there was one, is a long-term project. And I would argue Afghanistan's the same. So what I would be doing is finding ways to start very gently whittling away at the issues. The Taliban need things. There are conversations to be had. They may take months, they may take years, they may take decades, but we shouldn't give up from trying to not engage with them in a positive way. And it's really important to understand what engaging means. It's not saying, I want, I met Putin many times, I engaged with Putin. Didn't mean I liked him. Didn't mean he liked me either, but you engage with people, and if you're a diplomat, you are always, or almost always, engaging with people who you don't want to, or you don't consider a friend. But your job is to engage with them. Your job is to try and find ways to make things better. So that would be where you kind of think. And it would be about talking to countries in the region. India is an obvious example on Afghanistan. You talk to countries who know much better than you do some of the cultural questions, back to cultural diplomacy, some of the issues that need to be raised. So you never give up, but you have to find small ways to start the process.
Thank you very much, Marcia, on this.